There are moments in Scripture when the veil between earth and heaven is lifted just for a moment, and we are allowed to see what no eye has seen. And in those moments, we encounter a scene so majestic, so overwhelming, so inspiring that it shakes the foundation of our hearts. One of those scenes is heavenly worship. The Bible doesn't describe heaven as a quiet garden or a silent sky. It describes heaven as a throne room trembling with glory, a place where worship is not scheduled, not forced, not rehearsed, but erupts like thunder from every corner of creation. It is the atmosphere of heaven. It is the language of angels. It is the heartbeat of eternity. And if you stay with me today, you're going to see why heaven worships the way it does, and why understanding that should change the way you live your life right now. Because heavenly worship isn't just a future reality, it's a present calling. The worship of heaven begins with one word: worthy. Not worthy sometimes, not worthy on good days, not worthy when we feel like it, but worthy always, because in heaven, worship is not about music, it is about majesty. No one in heaven wonders if God deserves praise. No one debates his worth. No one questions his glory. There is no distraction, no hesitation, no competing priorities. Instead, every eye is fixed on the throne, and every heart is overwhelmed by the one who sits upon it. And why does this matter for us? Because what you behold determines how you worship. If your eyes are on your problems, your worship will be small. If your eyes are on your failures, your worship will be weak. But if your eyes are lifted to the throne of heaven, your worship will rise with strength, courage, and unshakable confidence. Heaven's worship is unified. Imagine the sound, not one voice, not a choir, not a multitude, but every living creature, every redeemed soul, every angelic host joining in one unstoppable declaration: blessing and honor and glory and power be to him who sits on the throne forever and ever. There is no division in heaven, no disagreement, no competing styles, no personal preferences. Why? Because the focus is not on the worshipers, it's on the one who is worshiped. And when the throne becomes your focus, everything else fades. But there is something more, something deeper. Heaven's worship reveals the identity of the redeemed. Down here we struggle, we strive, we question our purpose. But up there, standing in the radiance of God's presence, our purpose becomes undeniable. We were created to worship him, not because God needs our praise, but because we need his presence. And when you see him as he truly is, holy, exalted, reigning with all authority, worship becomes the natural response of your soul. So as we go deeper into this message, I urge you, stay with me. Don't miss what's coming next. Because the more clearly you understand heavenly worship, the more boldly you will live, the more passionately you will praise, and the more confidently you will walk into your God-given purpose. Heaven is calling. Its worship is echoing. And today we step into its sound. If you'd like, I can also generate YouTube description, hashtags, tags, thumbnail text, timestamps, or expand into a longer sermon. You said, Kanemi, I indirectly speech David Jeremiah a speaker wuyuti omenti onenji, ha in 500 wardis doent I in CLU I did ein diant I understandimenti demarite besting gigan jamawardi. Chat GPT said, here is your 500-word expansion of the Firestick keynote, written in direct speech in the style of David Jeremiah, without mentioning him and without headings or ending statements, full of engaging, powerful language. When I open the pages of Scripture and step into the scenes of heaven, I'm struck by something that should shake every one of us to our core. Heaven is not silent. Heaven is not still. Heaven is not a quiet chamber where angels tiptoe around the throne. No, heaven is alive with sound, alive with passion, alive with worship. It is a symphony that never fades, a choir that never loses strength, a declaration that never runs out of breath. And if we could hear it for just one moment, if our ears could catch a single note of that eternal anthem, it would change the way we worship forever. I want you to imagine this with me, not as a distant, far-off fantasy, but as a reality that exists right now, at this very second, while we breathe, while we sit, While we struggle through the noise of daily life, heaven is roaring with adoration. The throne of God is surrounded by praise so powerful, so overwhelming, that John says it sounded like the noise of rushing waters, like mighty thunder, like the voice of many multitudes pouring their hearts toward a single center of glory. And as I speak to you, I want you to feel the weight of that reality. I want you to sense the pull of that worship, because heaven is not waiting for us to arrive before it begins praising. Heaven is already erupting in worship. The question is not whether heaven is worshiping. The question is whether we will tune our hearts to its sound. There is no boredom in heaven, no complaining, no spiritual fatigue, no wandering minds. Why? Because the one who sits on the throne is so magnificent, so majestic, so infinitely worthy that every being in heaven is captivated. The seraphim don't take breaks. The elders don't lose focus. The angels don't get tired. They are caught in the never-ending astonishment of God's glory. And hear me, there is something deeply important here. Worship in heaven is not a duty. It is not an obligation. It is not a schedule on a heavenly calendar. Heavenly worship is a reaction, a response, a spontaneous overflow of awe, because God's presence is so overwhelming that silence is impossible. When you stand before glory, you worship. When you behold holiness, you bow. When you encounter majesty, your heart ignites. This is why I'm telling you, heaven is a symphony of worship, not because God demands it, but because He deserves it. The sheer weight of His worth forces every creature, from the mightiest angel to the smallest redeemed soul, to lift their voice in adoration. And the beauty of this is that heaven's worship isn't scattered, it's unified. Every voice, every heart, every being joins in one unstoppable declaration. Not competing, not comparing, not divided. They are drawn together by a single truth: the one on the throne is worthy. If you could hear that sound, just one moment of it, it would reorder every priority in your life. It would remind you that worship is not a song, not a style, not a moment. It is a response to the greatness of God, and heaven is inviting you to join that eternal symphony even now. You said, Kawe Endurestis BSS David Jeremias do ILA speaker Hutimenti Odi Okimio MTM I 500 Wardis Doent INCL Uda Haydan AADDN DN and Sapnamunti A Bidorai Spidimagiganinju and RD ChatGPT said, here is your 500-word expansion of the Sikaundi keynote written in direct speech in the style of David Jeremiah, without mentioning him and without headings or ending statements, fully engaging, powerful, and compelling. When I step into the passages of Scripture that describe the throne room of heaven, I am immediately confronted by a single reality that overshadows everything else. The worship of heaven begins with the worthiness of God, not the worthiness of man, not the worthiness of angels, not the worthiness of creation, but the unmatched, unchallenged, unchanging worthiness of the Almighty. And as I speak to you today, I want you to feel the weight of that truth pressing against your spirit, stirring something deep inside of you. Because in heaven, worthiness isn't a concept. They see it, they behold it, they are overwhelmed by it. The very moment your eyes lift to the throne, you understand instantly why heaven erupts in praise. There is no hesitation, no doubt, no question. You don't need to be convinced. You don't need to be persuaded. The glory of God is so overwhelming that worship becomes the only possible response. Picture the scene with me. The elders fall before Him, not because they are told to, but because they cannot stand in His presence. The angels circle the throne, not because they are assigned a task, but because His holiness draws them like gravity. The living creatures cry out, holy, 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 not because they practiced a song, but because every glimpse of His majesty ignites fresh awe within them. In heaven, worthiness is not debated, it is displayed. Let me tell you something important. Worship always begins with vision. When you see God as small, your worship will be small. When you see God as distant, your worship will be distant. But when you see God in His worthiness, His blazing holiness, His unshakable authority, His indescribable glory, your worship will rise with a force nothing on this earth can silence. That is why heaven doesn't grow quiet. That is why heaven never pauses its praise. They are forever in the presence of the one who is eternally worthy. Every moment reveals another facet of his greatness, and each revelation triggers a fresh wave of worship. Down here, we often worship based on how we feel. But in heaven, worship isn't based on emotion, it's based on revelation. They worship not because of circumstances, but because of God's character. They worship not because life is smooth, but because God is sovereign. They worship not because they feel strong, but because He is strong. And this is what I want to draw into your heart today. Worthiness is not something God earns. Worthiness is who He is. He doesn't become worthy because you worship Him. You worship Him because He is worthy. He doesn't wait for the world to approve Him. The world exists because He spoke it into being. He doesn't evolve into greatness. Greatness flows from His nature. If you could see what heaven sees, if you could behold what they behold, every shallow distraction would fall away and worship would rise from your soul like fire. You wouldn't need someone to encourage you to worship. You wouldn't need a song to move you. You would be drawn, captivated, overwhelmed by the infinite worthiness of the one who sits on the throne. You said, and DSPCAS David Jeremiah STUSTYL SPKR Weddinghami Omengi EMI 500 Wawardas Don't INCLUDADA Don't TEDIG Statman T. The start ECACTL from our T Expressanoa Parava use Kawao DEDD. Either Olowish Pure Ivrios ENSUCH A WYDHT Lo Came Conti Uos SBEC Chat GPT said here is the 500 word expansion of the THIRD keynote, written in direct speech in the style you want. Without headings, without ending statements, continuing exactly where the previous keynote ended and interlinked so it feels like one seamless, continuous speech. Wah! And when that realization grips your heart, when the worthiness of God becomes more than a concept and turns into a revelation, something else begins to unfold inside you. You begin to understand that what we experience on earth in our moments of worship, as sincere and beautiful as they may be, is only a shadow compared to what exists in heaven. What earthly worship lacks, heavenly worship completes. And I want you to feel the depth of that truth because it will reshape the way you approach every moment you lift your voice in praise. Down here, our worship is framed by limitations. We battle distractions. We fight weariness. We struggle with the noise of our own thoughts, the weight of our own worries, the brokenness of our world. Sometimes we come into worship carrying burdens so heavy we can hardly whisper a prayer, let alone raise our hands. Sometimes we step into moments of praise with minds scattered, hearts bruised, emotions conflicted, and even when we mean well, even when our intentions are pure, our worship is often fragmented, disrupted, inconsistent. But in heaven, there is no fragmentation. There is no wandering mind. There is no half-hearted praise. Worship there is whole. It is complete. It is perfect because the presence of God removes every barrier that weakens our earthly praise. Imagine for a moment what it will feel like when every distraction is finally silenced, when every burden has been lifted, when every tear has been wiped away, when every doubt has dissolved in the radiance of God's glory. That is the atmosphere in which heavenly worship takes place. And I want you to hear this. What we offer God on earth is precious to Him, but it is not yet what it will be. Our worship is like a child learning to speak true, sincere, meaningful, but still developing. In heaven, worship is the mature voice of the redeemed, unhindered by sin, untouched by sorrow, unclouded by fear. It is the worship we were always created for, but can only fully experience in the unfiltered presence of God. Yet here is the powerful part. Heaven's worship is not only a future reality, it is a present invitation. God allows us glimpses of that glory now. There are moments when heaven touches earth, moments when your spirit senses something greater than the room you're in, moments when the presence of God lifts you above the weight of your circumstances. Those moments are reminders, foretastes of what is coming. They are hints of the completion that awaits us. And this is where the connection matters. When you understand the worthiness of God, you begin to understand why heaven worships so perfectly. When you grasp the perfection of heaven's worship, you begin to see why our earthly praise often feels incomplete. And when you see both together, your heart begins to long, not for better music, not for stronger emotions, but for deeper revelation, for a clearer vision of the one who makes worship complete. Because the more clearly you see him, the more fully your worship will reflect heaven. You said, Kia andiarti SPECS David Jeremiah STYL A speak air woody at MN 500 ruardas de INT INCLUD AD INT and DMGS Tarti XXTL Afra and Mua TE Expresso OF Parview I use Kana ADD. I interior avio sinus su h a weo eight loke sam culture no chat GPT said here is the 500 word expansion of the 4th keynote written in direct speech in the same continuous flow, starting exactly where the previous keynote ended, without headings, without an ending statement, fully in the style you requested. And as that longing grows inside you, as your heart begins to desire what heaven experiences in fullness, something becomes unmistakably clear. Worship in heaven is not a ritual, it is a response to glory that cannot be ignored, a response to holiness that cannot be dismissed, a response to majesty so overwhelming that silence becomes impossible. And this is where the contrast between earthly worship and heavenly worship becomes even more profound. Down here, we often structure our worship. We plan it. We schedule it. We fit it into services, bulletins, time slots. We treat worship as an event we attend rather than a fire that burns within us. We sometimes wait for music to warm us, for lyrics to inspire us, for an atmosphere to move us. But in heaven, there is no warm-up, no preparation, no external trigger. Worship erupts, not because of a melody, not because of a choir, not because of a worship leader, but because the presence of God is so blindingly real that the soul must respond. Picture those moments described in Scripture when the living beings around the throne catch a fresh glimpse of His glory. Every time they see another measure of His holiness, they erupt again, crying, "Holy, holy, holy," not out of repetition, but out of revelation. They are not reciting, they are reacting. Every word is a spontaneous outburst of awe from beings overwhelmed by the one before them. And this is what connects so deeply with the longing inside us. You see, we were crafted for that kind of worship, not manufactured, not rehearsed, not dependent on mood or environment, but flowing naturally from an awakened heart. A heart that has seen God clearly enough to respond without hesitation. A heart that worships because it cannot do otherwise. Let me tell you something, heavenly worship is the purest expression of truth. There is no pretense in it, no performance in it, no self-consciousness in it. No one in heaven is thinking about who's watching, how they look, or whether their voice sounds acceptable. They are consumed, captured, infused with the reality of God's presence. When the soul touches a being so infinitely worthy, worship rises as naturally as breath. And this is why worship on earth sometimes feels incomplete, because we are not yet fully seeing what heaven sees. But the more we behold God, the more our worship transforms from ritual to response. It stops being something we do and becomes something we cannot help doing. It moves from obligation to overflow. This is why moments in worship that touch your spirit so deeply, moments when you feel tears forming, or your heart softens, or your hands rise without you thinking about it, are so significant. Those are not emotional reactions, they are spiritual responses. They are glimpses of what heaven experiences constantly. They are your spirit reacting to a faint echo of the glory that one day will fill your entire existence. When worship becomes response, not ritual, you step closer to the heartbeat of heaven. You said, "Canen directus BHAS David Jeremiah Stowile S speaker Bibiap you Mendirwaitai and 500 or did di and fila do in EDMA and do and didibam and starta XTLF Ramarati of acceptance of Prar Eva use K Indida. INTR Luis analysis CHAYT mat IGHT loksam katu SPH GPT said, here is your 500 word expansion of the F5TH keynote written in direct speech in the same continuous flow, starting exactly where the previous keynote ended, fully integrated, without headings and without an ending statement awe. And when you step closer to that heartbeat, Something even more breathtaking becomes clear. In heaven, worship is unified, not scattered, not divided, not fragmented by personal preference or separated by opinion. Every voice, every being, every creature under heaven and earth joins in one sound, one declaration, one unstoppable anthem directed toward the throne of God. And this truth should shake us because it shows us what worship was always meant to be. Down here, we often struggle with divisions, denominations, styles, cultures, generations. We debate music, genres, instruments, volume, lighting, and atmosphere. We let preferences take the place of passion. But in heaven, there is none of that. No one is arguing about how worship should sound. No one is comparing their voice to another's. No one is holding back because the tone isn't their style. In heaven, worship is not about the worshipers. It is about the one they are worshiping. Imagine the scene John describes, an entire multitude, too vast to count, from every nation, every tongue, every people, all standing together, lifting a single voice in praise. No ego, no division, no rivalry, just perfect agreement, perfect harmony, perfect unity under the supremacy of God. The living creatures, the elders, the angels, the redeemed, every one of them, different in form and purpose, but unified in worship because the one on the throne is worthy of nothing less. And here is what grips me most. Unity is not something they work to achieve in heaven. It is something they naturally express. Unity isn't an effort, it's an overflow. Because when the throne becomes your focus, everything else fades. Preferences fade, differences fade, opinions fade. The only thing that matters is the one who sits in majesty at the center of it all. If you and I could witness that unity just for a moment, every argument about worship on earth would lose its power. We would stop asking, do I like this song? And start asking, does this exalt the one who is worthy? We would stop evaluating worship based on style and start embracing it based on substance. Because when the glory of God takes center stage, unity becomes our natural response. And listen carefully, unity in worship is not sameness. Heaven is not a place of identical voices. It is a place of surrendered voices. The angels sound different from the elders. The redeemed sound different from the living creatures. But together, they form a harmony so powerful that it shakes the foundations of heaven. That is what worship looks like when God becomes the focal point. When every heart is pointed toward the same throne, every voice aligns itself with the same praise, not because they are trying to match each other, but because their eyes are fixed on the same glory. When you see Him clearly, you don't compete, you unite. You don't compare, you surrender. You don't hold back, you join the chorus. Because the throne does what nothing else can do. It brings every soul into perfect alignment, drawing all creation into one unstoppable voice of praise. You said, Sister White, I'm direct ESP, EHS, David Jeremiah, STY, LES, Speaker, Rewy, Hound, Aming, Honor, Dion, and Hammond, 500, we Rs, Don, INCUD, DNT, INGSTMA, Start, EXCTLY, From, Malaher, T, XBSI, OFP, Rose, Keti, NED. INTROVIOS, ISUCH, away, ICHI, LOG, SAMCOW, TIOUS, PEECHA. ChatGPT said, here is your 500-word expansion of this XDH keynote written in direct speech in the same continuous flow, starting exactly where the previous keynote ended, in the style you want, without headings and without an ending statement. And as that unified chorus rises around the throne, something remarkable becomes undeniable in heaven. Worship doesn't just glorify God, it reveals the true identity of the redeemed. It unveils who we really are, not who the world said we were, not who our past labeled us, not who our failures tried to define us as, but who we were created to be from the beginning, worshipers shaped, sealed, and restored by the love and power of God. Because when you stand in the presence of the one who redeemed you, the masks fall off, the doubts dissolve, the insecurities disappear, the lies you believed about yourself lose their grip. Heaven's worship becomes the mirror that finally shows your true reflection, not broken, not lost, not inadequate, but redeemed, restored, and crowned with purpose. Down here, we wrestle with identity. We struggle with questions like, who am I? Or am I enough? What is my purpose? And life doesn't make it easier. People speak words that wound us. Experiences leave marks that confuse us. The enemy whispers lies that limit us. But in heaven, all of that is stripped away, and your identity shines in its truest form. One who belongs to God, one who has been purchased by the Lamb, one whose voice was meant to rise in eternal praise. When the redeemed lift their voices in heaven, they aren't just singing, they're stepping into the fullness of who they are. Worship becomes the language of identity. It becomes the proof that you were never made for darkness, never made for bondage, never made for fear. You were made for His presence. You were made to stand before His throne. You were made to carry the song of the redeemed. And hear me. This is why heavenly worship is so powerful. It is not passive. It is not background music. It is declaration. It is proclamation. It is identity spoken loudly, freely, fearlessly. Every time the redeemed sin, they're not only honoring God, they're affirming who they have become through His grace. Think about those elders casting their crowns at the feet of the one on the throne. Those crowns represent identity, authority, victory, reward. But in worship, they surrender them willingly, not because they lose identity, but because they finally understand the source of it. They lay down what He gave them out of love for the one who gave it. That is identity rooted in worship. And let this sink into your heart. Your truest self emerges when you are in the presence of God. That's why the enemy tries so hard to interrupt your worship, because he knows worship awakens identity. He knows worship strengthens clarity. He knows worship aligns your heart with heaven and reminds you that you are not who this world says you are who God says you are. In heaven, worship and identity are inseparable. The redeemed don't worship to become someone. They worship because they finally know who they are. You said, Kindiarenti SBEHAS David Jeremias to while ASPIC we radio minimenta vitam hamin 500 words do INCLD EDNG statamenti start EXATL way FTW FRAM Malhar cracks binds now Perio US key INTA NDD. Yantrvi OCNs Enos UCH Amuithet Locus Amakanti and UOS SPECH. ChatGPT said here is a fresh 500-word continuation written as if the previous keynote ended exactly where it did, continuing the same flow, same tone, same style, without headings, without ending statements, and without mentioning David Jeremiah. This is written as the next part, not a repeat, so your speech continues smoothly and seamlessly, and when you finally recognize that your identity is awakened in worship, something even deeper begins to unfold. Worship becomes the atmosphere where the presence of God transforms you from the inside out. You see, in heaven, worship is not just expression, it is transformation. Every moment before the throne reshapes, refines, renews, and restores the soul. Nothing remains the same in the presence of God. Not your fears, not your wounds, not your memories, not your weaknesses. His presence has a way of touching everything that ever tried to diminish you. Down here on earth, we often look for transformation in external things. We think a change of surroundings, a different season, a new opportunity, a fresh start, or a better circumstance will remake us. But true transformation does not begin on the outside. It begins in the presence of God. In heaven, worship isn't simply an activity. It is the environment where glory works on the heart like fire refining gold. Every note of worship, every cry of praise, every moment near the throne purifies an old layer, breaks an old chain, and reveals a new brilliance within the redeemed. And that is why heaven's worship is so continuous, not because God demands constant noise, but because His presence constantly transforms. The redeemed are always receiving, always growing, always discovering more of who He is and more of who they are in Him. Worship is not something they give and walk away from. It is something they live in, breathe in, and are forever changed by. Think about this: the closer you get to the throne, the more clearly you see yourself, not through the lens of failure, but through the lens of redemption. Not through the lens of the past, but through the lens of perfection. When the redeemed gather around the throne, they do not stand as broken people patched together by grace. They stand as perfected saints completed by the glory of God. Their transformation is the evidence of his love, and their worship becomes the expression of that transformation. And if that is what heaven looks like, imagine what even a small touch of that presence can do in your life right now. A single moment in his presence can lift heaviness that years of struggle could not break. A single whisper of his voice can silence lies that echoed in your mind for decades. A single glimpse of his glory can ignite hope where you thought nothing could grow again. That is why the enemy fights your worship so fiercely, because he knows what worship unlocks in your life. When you worship, you step into the presence that transforms. When you worship, you align your heart with the atmosphere of heaven. When you worship, you allow God to do the work only he can do, rebuilding what was lost, healing what was broken, restoring what was stolen, awakening what was buried. Worship is where transformation begins, and heaven shows us what that transformation looks like in its fullest form, because the soul becomes most like Christ in the place where it worships him most fully. You said, I do TSBS David Jeremiah Stiwa speaker Rebbe humanity Igi and 500 wa RDs doing. INCL do die and ND wine IND Timanti. Let's take EUXETLY from money shot te expense when of Fravios K END. I enter Arvo is ENS CUCH AMI IDH to IVOCOS SBECH GPT said, here is your 500-word expansion of the SEV and T and TH keynote written in direct speech, same continuous flow, same tone. No headings, no ending statement, no mention of David Jeremiah, and starting exactly where the previous keynote ended. And when the soul becomes more like Christ through the atmosphere of worship, something extraordinary begins to happen. Worship no longer feels like something you do. It becomes something you carry. It becomes a presence, a posture, a continual awareness that God is near, that heaven is real, that the throne is occupied, and that your life is connected to a realm more powerful than anything you see on this earth. In heaven, worship is not a moment, it's a lifestyle. It's the very environment in which the redeemed exist. Everything they do flows from the throne, and everything they experience circles back to the glory of God. And here is the breathtaking part, that heavenly lifestyle of worship isn't just something we will experience someday. It's something we are invited to begin right now. The same presence that surrounds the throne is the presence God places within the hearts of his people. The same Spirit who empowers heavenly worship is the Spirit who lives inside you. That means worship doesn't start when the music begins. Worship starts when your heart awakens. Heaven teaches us that worship is not measured by volume, but by surrender. It's not measured by emotion, but by devotion. It's not measured by how loudly we sing, but how fully we yield. In heaven, every part of their being is aligned with the glory of God. Mind, spirit, will, desire. Everything is in agreement. Everything is in harmony. Everything is fully yielded. And that's the challenge to us on earth, to let worship reach deeper than our lips and travel into the core of our being. Because when worship is lifestyle, not ritual, it affects how you think, how you respond, how you love, how you endure, how you forgive, how you walk through storms, how you face giants, how you resist temptation, how you navigate uncertainty. Worship becomes the anchor of your identity and the compass of your decisions. When heaven worships, they are not only expressing honor, they are maintaining alignment. They are living in the reality of God's supremacy. That's why fear has no place there. That's why doubt cannot survive. That's why anxiety cannot breathe. Because worship aligns everything with the truth of who God is. And once your spirit is aligned with that truth, nothing in this world has the power to shake you. Imagine what would happen in your life if worship became that kind of alignment for you. Imagine walking through the week with your heart constantly turned toward the throne. Imagine facing trouble while your spirit remains anchored in praise. Imagine waking up with a sense of God's nearness and going to bed with a sense of his sovereignty. That is what heaven experiences every moment, and that is what God invites you to taste even now. When worship becomes a lifestyle, the atmosphere of heaven starts invading the atmosphere of your life. Peace flows where there was pressure. Joy rises where there was heaviness. Clarity shows up where confusion tried to take over. Worship begins shaping your responses more than your circumstances do. Because the soul that carries worship carries the presence of the one who is worshipped. You said, Q-I-N-D-R-I-T-S-P-E-H-A-S David Jeremiah S-T-Y-L-E-S-P-K-R I-T-I-D-M and 500 words done T-I-N-C-O-U-D-I-G-A-N-D-O-N-T-S E-D-N-S-T-M-E-N-T Start E-X-A-Q-I-F-R-X-P-O-A-P-O-V-S-H-O-K-N-E-E-N-D-D I-R-V-I-H-P-I-O-C-N-C-U-C-H-O-Y-O-H-T-M-O-H-T-N-O S-B-E-H-H-G-P-T said. And that brings me right into this final truth, because if everything we've walked through until now has been shaping your heart, then this last part is meant to anchor your spirit. You see, sometimes God lets you walk into a season where the lights dim, not to frighten you, but to adjust your spiritual sight so you can finally see what was hidden in the brightness. And it's in those moments, those quiet, breath-held moments, where He whispers, I have not left. I am aligning you. So as we step into this last keynote, let me pick up exactly where we ended with the realization that every struggle, every unanswered question, every delay has been part of a holy orchestration. But now, hear me, there comes a point where alignment becomes assignment. There comes a threshold where God stops simply shaping you and starts sending you. And many of you feel that tremor in your soul even now. It's that stirring, that holy restlessness, that gentle tug that keeps telling you, you were made for more than what you're settling for. And friend, that's not your imagination. That's divine direction. Because when God brings you out of a refining season, He doesn't bring you out empty-handed. He brings you out equipped. He brings you out wiser, stronger, clearer. He brings you out with a voice you didn't have before, with courage you never knew you carried, with convictions that have been tried in the fire and proven unshakable. And let me say this, when God prepares to lift you, He first prepares the ground beneath you. That's why some of the places you thought were falling apart were actually being leveled, flattened, cleared so He could build something new. You were praying for stability, but God was giving you foundation. You were asking for progress, but God was giving you structure. You were crying for movement, but God was preparing momentum. And this is where your part comes in. You must decide whether you will step into the future He's crafted for you or cling to the familiar that no longer fits you. Because the truth is, some seasons don't close gently, they close firmly. Some doors don't drift shut, they slam. Not to punish you, but to protect you from returning to places where you've already outgrown the lesson. So hear this with your spirit. When God shifts you, respond. When He calls you, answer. When He nudges you, move. Delayed obedience only delays breakthrough. Half-hearted obedience only produces half-formed miracles. If He is calling you higher, stop trying to convince yourself that the valley is comfortable. If He is leading you forward, stop rehearsing the reasons to stay where you are. Because this final keynote is about stepping into divine readiness. It's about understanding that God has not only prepared a path for you, He has prepared you for the path. And every moment of pressure was shaping the leader, the believer, the warrior, the witness He knew you could become. You didn't survive by accident. You were strengthened on purpose. So move with conviction, step with certainty, and live with the awareness that heaven has already gone before you. God has already positioned what you need on the road ahead. You are not walking into uncertainty. You are walking into fulfillment. And the God who carried you through the wilderness is the same God who will establish you in the promise.